The weight of the final notice in my apron pocket felt heavier than the stack of plates balanced on my arm. Every clink of silverware, every burst of laughter from the oblivious diners at La Stella was a countdown to my financial ruin. My mother's medical bills were a ghost that haunted my every waking moment, a debt carved into my soul. I moved through the tables with a practiced smile, but inside I was crumbling. My gaze kept drifting to table 7, tucked away in a discreet corner. A man sat there, his suit so perfectly tailored it seemed like a second skin, dark and severe. He radiated a stillness that was more intimidating than any noise. Opposite him, a little girl sat in a booster seat, her tiny fork pushing a piece of pasta around her plate. She was beautiful, with dark curls and eyes so vast and empty they swallowed the light. She hadn't made a sound all evening, a silent porcelain doll in a world of chaotic noise. The man, her father, watched her with an intensity that was terrifying and heartbreaking all at once. It was a look of profound, desperate love, tangled with an agony I couldn't place, and for a moment I forgot my own troubles, captivated by theirs. Then it happened. The little girl's fork clattered onto her plate. Her head lifted and her dark, vacant eyes scanned the room before they landed on me. A flicker of something, recognition, curiosity, I don't know what, crossed her face. She raised a small, delicate hand, her finger pointing directly at me. The man leaned forward, his entire body tensed, a desperate hope etched into his handsome, severe features. "Lily?" he whispered, his voice a low rumble that barely carried. And then a sound emerged from the child, clear and piercing in the sudden lull of the restaurant's chatter. It was a single word, the first she had apparently uttered in a very long time, and it struck me with the force of a physical blow. "Mama!" If you've ever felt a moment that seemed to rewrite the rules of your own life, you'll understand the silence that followed. For anyone who has felt a connection so deep and sudden it defies all logic, I hope you'll stay with me for this story. Your support means the world, so if you're already hooked, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss what happened in the aftermath of that single impossible word. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Diners at nearby tables fell silent, their conversations dying in their throats as they stared. My manager shot me a panicked look from across the room, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot by the weight of that little girl's gaze and the echo of her word. The man at the table, Marco DeLuca, as I would soon learn, looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His mask of cold control had shattered, revealing a raw, staggering vulnerability. For a heartbeat, he was no longer a powerful, intimidating figure, but simply a father witnessing a miracle. A man standing beside him, older and with the wary eyes of a loyal soldier, placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. I felt a strange pang in my own chest, an echo of the grief for my own mother, a longing for a connection I thought I'd lost forever. I forced myself to move, to clear a nearby table, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped a water glass. I could feel his eyes on me, not leaving me for a second, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my shift would not end with me simply clocking out and going home. As the last of the dinner crowd thinned out, the man I now knew as Ricardo approached me while I was wiping down my final table. He asked me in a tone that was polite but left no room for refusal if Mr. DeLuca could have a word with me in private. My heart hammered against my ribs. I followed him through a door I'd never been through, into a small, opulent office reserved for the owner. Marco DeLuca was standing by the window, looking out at the glittering city lights, but he turned as I entered. Up close, the intensity of his presence was overwhelming. "My daughter," he began, his voice low and steady, yet threaded with a desperate urgency, "has not spoken a word in a year, not since her mother was taken from us." He didn't elaborate on the violence that word implied. He simply stated it as a fact, a foundational piece of his broken world. Then he looked directly at me, his gaze pinning me in place. "I don't know why she chose you, Miss Petrova, but I will pay you anything. Name your price. I need you to be near her, to be her companion." The offer hung in the air, a preposterous, life-altering proposition that sounded more like a command than a request. My mind reeled, a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. This was the stuff of fiction, not the life of a waitress drowning in debt. My first instinct, the one my best friend Sophia would have screamed at me to follow, was to run. This man's world was one of tailored suits, silent bodyguards, and unspoken violence. It was a world where wives were taken, not lost. Getting involved was a fool's errand, a dangerous fantasy that could get me killed. But then my thoughts drifted back to Lily. I saw her small, pale face, the heartbreaking emptiness in her eyes that had been momentarily filled with light when she looked at me. The word mama wasn't just a sound. It was a lifeline she had thrown out into the void, and it had somehow landed at my feet. My own loneliness felt like a cavern inside me, a space carved out by the loss of my own mother. I knew what it was to ache for that comfort, that safety. The money he offered was a practical escape from my problems, a way to finally put my mother's memory to rest without the shame of debt. But the true pull was something far deeper, an instinctual, protective urge toward a child who saw a mother in a stranger. I took a deep breath, the scent of expensive leather and his subtle cologne filling my senses. I met his gaze, my decision solidifying in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "I'm not a nanny, Mr. DeLuca," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "and I cannot replace her mother." A flicker of respect or perhaps surprise crossed his features. "I'm not asking you to," he replied, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "I'm just asking you to be there." I saw it then, beneath the layers of power and control, a father desperate to hear his daughter's voice again, willing to grasp at any sliver of hope. That shared humanity was the bridge I chose to cross. "My only condition," I added, feeling a surge of courage I didn't know I possessed, "is that Lily's emotional and physical safety is the absolute priority. Always." He gave a single decisive nod. Always. The deal was sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared look of desperate understanding. As Ricardo escorted me out, I felt a profound sense of finality. I had just traded my simple, predictable life of grief and struggle for a gilded cage, and I had no idea what awaited me inside. The next morning, a sleek black car, silent as a shadow, pulled up in front of my worn-out apartment building. As I stepped inside, the plush leather interior felt like a different universe from my cozy, cluttered living room filled with secondhand books and potted plants. The drive was quiet, taking me further and further into a part of the city defined by high walls and iron gates. We finally stopped before a breathtaking mansion of glass and white stone, a modern fortress that was both magnificent and terrifyingly sterile. It was a home built to keep the world out, and it looked more like a museum than a place where a child lived. Ricardo led me through the cavernous foyer, where my footsteps echoed on the polished marble floors. Every surface gleamed. Every piece of furniture was an untouchable work of art. The air was still and cool, heavy with a silence that felt even more profound than the one Lily carried with her. Then I saw her. She was standing at the top of a sweeping, suspended staircase, a small figure in a simple white dress, clutching a worn teddy bear. She just watched me, her dark eyes wide and unreadable. She didn't speak, but in her gaze I saw the question that was screaming in my own heart. Who are you, and what are you doing here? My return to the restaurant the next day was met with a wall of strange silence. My manager, a man who usually thrived on drama, couldn't even meet my eye. He pulled me into his office, the same opulent room where Marco DeLuca had made his impossible offer, and told me my employment was terminated, effective immediately. He stammered about disruptions and maintaining a certain atmosphere, but the real reason hung unspoken in the air between us: fear. Marco DeLuca's presence had marked me, made me a liability. I was a ghost in my own workplace, an uncomfortable reminder of a power that operated on a different plane. I handed over my apron, the final notice for my mother's debt still tucked inside, its weight now 100 times heavier. Walking out onto the street, the city noise felt muted, distant. I had lost my job not for any mistake I had made, but because a little girl had called me Mama. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. I had stepped into a different world for a few hours, and now my own had slammed the door shut behind me, leaving me utterly and completely alone with a mountain of debt I had no way to climb. The phone call started that evening. The debt collection agency, once just a persistent annoyance, had escalated their tactics. The man on the other end, a Mr. Henderson, had a voice like gravel and oil. He was no longer asking for payment arrangements. He was making threats. He mentioned knowing where I lived, where my friend Sophia worked. He even brought up my ex-husband, Dimitri, a name I hadn't heard in 2 years, a ghost from a past I had fought desperately to bury. Apparently, some of his gambling debts had been tangled with the final medical expenses, a nasty surprise left behind in the fine print. The number, that monstrous figure that represented my mother's final days, was no longer just a financial burden. It had become a weapon pointed directly at me. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking, the four walls of my tiny apartment feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a flimsy cardboard box. The world outside was full of predators, and I had just lost the only camouflage I had. My predictable, exhausting life had been hard, but this new reality was something far more terrifying. It was a corner, and I was being backed into it with alarming speed. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Dimitri showed up at my door the next night. He looked the same cheap suit, the same smile that never reached his eyes, the same sense of desperation clinging to him like stale cologne. He'd heard through the grapevine about the incident at La Stella, about a rich man taking an interest in me. "Just came to see how my favorite girl is doing," he cooed, trying to push his way inside. I blocked the door, the old familiar fear a cold spike in my gut. I remembered the nights I'd spent hiding bruises, the way he could turn from charming to monstrous in the blink of an eye. Sophia came out of her room, telling him to leave, but he just laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "We're just talking," he said, his eyes fixed on me, calculating. "You look like you've had a rough time, Elena, but maybe your luck is about to change. Our luck." The way he said "our" sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't here to reconnect. He was here to claim a piece of a fortune that didn't even exist, and I knew he wouldn't be easily discouraged. The standoff at my doorway was broken by a presence so absolute, so chillingly silent, that both Dimitri and I froze. Marco De Luca was standing at the end of the hallway, with Riccardo just behind him. He hadn't made a sound. He simply appeared, a figure of dark, tailored perfection against the peeling paint of my apartment building. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly predatory, his eyes taking in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Dimitri's hand on the doorframe, the fear on my face, the defiant stance of my friend Sophia. He didn't look angry. He looked empty. It was a terrifying void, a stillness that promised a capacity for violence far beyond anything Dimitri could comprehend. "Let go of her door," Marco said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the cramped hallway. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of how things were now going to be. Dimitri, blinded by his own arrogance, actually scoffed, a fatal mistake that sealed his fate in that single foolish moment. He had no idea what kind of line he had just crossed. Dimitri turned, a sneer on his face. "And who the hell are you?" he asked, taking a step toward Marco. Before the last word left his mouth, Riccardo moved. It wasn't a fight. It was a simple, brutal equation. One moment Dimitri was standing, the next he was on the floor, gasping for air, his arm bent at an angle that was sickeningly wrong. Marco never took his eyes off me. He stepped over my ex-husband's writhing body as if he were a piece of trash on the sidewalk, and stopped in front of me. He looked into my apartment, his gaze lingering on the worn-out furniture, the stack of bills on my small kitchen table. He saw everything. He saw the poverty I tried so hard to hide, the struggle that defined my every waking moment. His expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a cold, hard fury that wasn't directed at me, but at the world that had allowed this to happen. "This is the life you're protecting?" he asked, his voice still quiet, but now laced with an edge of steel. The question was a scalpel, cutting away my pride and exposing the raw, desperate truth beneath it. The next morning, the bright pink of an eviction notice was taped to my front door. It felt like the world was conspiring to leave me with no options, systematically stripping away every last piece of my independence. I had lost my job, been harassed by my ex, and was now on the verge of losing my home. I slumped to the floor in the hallway, the official paper crinkling in my hand, and finally allowed the tears to come. They weren't just for my current situation, but for everything I had lost. My mother, my sense of safety, my belief that hard work and a good heart were enough to get by. Sophia sat with me, her arm around my shoulders, but there were no words of comfort that could fix this. My pride was a stubborn, foolish thing. It screamed at me not to call him, not to accept help from a man whose world was built on violence and fear. I would be indebted to him, a bird in a beautiful, unbreakable cage. But the alternative was the street, a different kind of cage with dangers far more random and cruel. The choice was between two prisons, and I was beginning to realize one offered a gilded form of safety the other could never promise. His call came that afternoon, as if he could sense my resolve crumbling. It was Marco himself, not Riccardo. "Elena," he said, his voice a calm, steady presence in the chaos of my thoughts. "There are two things you need to know. First, your mother's medical debt has been paid in full. It is done." I was speechless, the air knocked from my lungs. He had erased the number that had haunted me for years with a casual finality that was breathtaking. "Second," he continued, not waiting for a response, "Dimitri will not be a problem for you again. Ever." The certainty in his tone was absolute, and I didn't dare ask for details. He had surgically removed the two most immediate threats from my life without even asking my permission. "Lily has been asking for you," he then said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "She drew a picture. It's of you." That was the blow that shattered the last of my resistance. It wasn't about the money or the threats anymore. It was about a little girl with a crayon waiting for me, a child who needed me. I closed my eyes, picturing Lily's small face, the vast emptiness in her eyes that had, for a moment, been filled with something that looked like hope. I saw the eviction notice, the shadow of Dimitri in my doorway, the endless nights of worrying about money. My life was a sinking ship, and Marco De Luca was offering not just a life raft, but a battleship. It was a dangerous, terrifying vessel, but it was afloat. "What do you want from me?" I whispered into the phone, my voice hoarse. "I want you to be safe," he answered simply. "And I want my daughter to be happy. Come and live in my home, be her companion. I will give you a salary that will ensure you never have to worry about money again. But more than that, you will have my protection. No one will ever harm you again." It was an impossible deal, a fairy tale bargain with a man who was no prince. It was a surrender of the life I knew for one I couldn't possibly imagine, but it was also the only choice I had left. "Okay," I said, the single word feeling like the heaviest thing I'd ever lifted. "I'll do it." An hour later, the sleek black car was parked outside my building again. This time, Ricardo didn't wait for me to come down. He came to my door and carried my single suitcase for me. I paused in the doorway of my apartment, taking one last look at the cozy, cluttered space that held the last vestiges of my old life. The potted plants, the secondhand books, the framed photograph of my smiling mother on the nightstand. I picked up the photo and tucked it carefully into my handbag. It was the only thing I truly couldn't leave behind. As I walked down the hallway, I tore the pink eviction notice from my door and let it fall to the floor. It was a relic from a life that was no longer mine. Stepping into the cool leather interior of the car felt like crossing a threshold into another reality. The door closed with a soft, definitive thud, sealing me inside. As we pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back. I was heading toward a fortress of glass and steel, toward a man shrouded in secrets, and toward a little girl who thought I was her mother. My fear was a living thing inside me, but it was now intertwined with a sliver of purpose. I had made my impossible choice. Life inside the De Luca mansion was a study in contradictions, a world of opulent silence governed by unspoken rules. My new room was larger than my entire old apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a meticulously manicured garden that felt more like a sculpture than a place for a child to play. Every morning, Ricardo would provide me with a schedule for Lily, detailing everything from her meals, which were prepared by a private chef, to her educational playtime. It was efficient, sterile, and suffocating. I felt like a rare specimen being observed in a pristine glass enclosure. The only warmth in this cold, perfect house was Lily herself. She became my shadow, her small hand constantly seeking mine, her dark eyes following my every move. She was the anchor in this strange, disorienting new reality. I was living in a palace, wearing clothes I could never have afforded, and eating gourmet food, but I had never felt more like a prisoner. The gilded bars of my cage were beautiful, but they were bars nonetheless, and I was acutely aware that Marco De Luca was the one who held the key. I spent my days trying to inject some warmth and spontaneity into Lily's rigid world, and my nights staring out at the city lights, wondering if I had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. My first real conversation with Marco took place 2 days after my arrival. I found him in his study, a cavernous room lined with books he'd likely never read, a massive mahogany desk separating us like a barricade. He didn't ask me to sit. He simply began speaking, his voice low and devoid of warmth as he outlined his expectations. He wanted detailed daily reports on Lily's progress, her vocabulary, her moods. He spoke of her as a project to be managed, a problem to be solved. A surge of defiance rose in me, hot and unexpected. "She's not a business merger, Mr. De Luca," I interrupted, my voice trembling slightly. "She's a little girl. She needs to play in the dirt, to make a mess, to be read fairy tales, not have her every word logged in a report." He stopped, his gaze sharpening on me. I saw a flicker of something in his cold eyes. Annoyance, surprise, perhaps even a sliver of respect. He was a man who commanded, who was obeyed without question. My challenging him was a disruption to the very air he breathed. For a long moment, the silence stretched, a tense cord between us. Then he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Do what you feel is best for her," he conceded, "but you will still report to me." It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first time I felt like more than just another one of his acquisitions. In the days that followed, a fragile routine began to form. Lily, away from the rigid structure her father had imposed, started to blossom. We baked cookies in the enormous, sterile kitchen, leaving a fine dusting of flour on every gleaming surface, a small act of rebellion that made me smile. We built forts out of expensive silk cushions in the living room and read stories in a sunny corner of the garden. One afternoon, she sat at a small table, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she drew with a set of crayons. After a while, she proudly held up her creation. It was a picture of 3 stick figures under a bright yellow sun.
A small one with dark curls, a taller one with my long brown hair, and a very tall, stern-looking figure in a black suit. Underneath, she had painstakingly written 3 words: Lily, Lena, Papa. My heart clenched. I was Lena now. I was part of her world, part of her drawing of a family. I felt a wave of love for this little girl, so powerful it was physically painful, immediately followed by a crushing sense of guilt. I was a fraud, a placeholder for the mother she had lost. I looked up and saw Marco standing in the doorway, watching us. His face was a mask of stone, but I saw the flicker of pain and longing in his eyes before he turned and walked away, leaving me with the child's drawing and the weight of our shared, complicated grief. The first crack in the fortress appeared on a Tuesday morning. I was in the garden with Lily, teaching her how to plant pansies in a small pot, when I saw Ricardo near the front gate, his body tense. He was speaking urgently into his phone, his gaze sweeping the perimeter. A moment later, he bent down and picked something up from the pristine white gravel of the driveway. He moved quickly, his movements economical and precise, wrapping the object in a handkerchief before striding back toward the house. I tried to get a better look, but he was too fast. Later, when Lily was napping, I found him in the kitchen instructing the staff to double-check all locks and activate the full evening security protocol, hours ahead of schedule. "What was that?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "What did you find?" He turned to me, his expression professionally blank, but his eyes were hard. "It was nothing, Alina. A dead bird, probably a cat." His dismissal was too quick, too smooth. I knew he was lying. I had seen the shape of it, the unnatural stillness. It hadn't been a random act of nature. It had been placed there. A message, a warning. The sterile safety of the mansion suddenly felt thin as glass, and I knew with a chilling certainty that the dangers of Marco's world were no longer just a vague concept. They were at our doorstep, waiting. That evening, I waited for Marco in his study, my heart hammering against my ribs. I refused to be treated like a fragile doll, to be shielded from a reality that directly affected the child I was supposed to be protecting. When he walked in, I didn't wait for him to speak. "Ricardo lied to me today," I stated, my voice steadier than I felt. "It wasn't just a bird, was it? It was a message." He stopped pouring himself a drink, his back to me. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. "This does not concern you, Elena," he finally said, his voice a low growl. "Your job is to care for my daughter. My job is to ensure this house is the safest place in the world for you both." The cold fury in his tone was meant to intimidate, to end the conversation. But I thought of Lily's trusting face, of the black object on the white gravel. "How can I protect her if I'm blind?" I shot back, stepping closer. "I need to know what we're up against. I am not one of your soldiers, Marco. I will not follow orders blindly when it comes to her." He turned then, his eyes blazing with a dark, contained fire. "You have no idea what you're asking," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Knowing will not make you safer. It will only make you more afraid." And in that moment, I realized he was trying to protect me, not just from his enemies, but from the terrifying truth of his own life. Later that night, unable to sleep, I wandered through the silent house. A sliver of light from under the study door drew me in. I pushed it open gently, expecting to find the room empty. But Marco was there, sitting in a leather armchair, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. He wasn't working. He was staring at a large, framed portrait on the wall, one I hadn't noticed before. It was of a breathtakingly beautiful woman with dark hair and a radiant smile, her eyes full of life. Isabella, his late wife. In his hand, he held a small, empty whiskey glass. He looked utterly broken, stripped bare of his power and control. All the menace was gone,
replaced by a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. I felt like an intruder on a sacred private sorrow. I backed away silently, but he must have sensed my presence. "She loved lilies," he said, his voice thick and rough, not looking at me. "She planted them all over the garden." I didn't know what to say. There were no words for a loss that immense. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the kitchen and made him a cup of chamomile tea, just as I had for my mother during her worst nights. I placed it on the table beside him without a word and left him alone with his ghosts. A fragile peace settled over the next few weeks. Lily's vocabulary exploded. She chattered constantly, filling the silent mansion with the sound of her laughter and her endless questions. She called me Lena and Marco Papa, and for brief, stolen moments, we felt like a real family. One sunny afternoon, we were in the garden, a sprawling green sanctuary surrounded by high, ivy-covered walls. I was pushing Lily on a swing, her small legs kicking with delight as she soared higher and higher. "Higher, Lena, higher," she squealed, her laughter echoing in the warm air. I glanced toward the house and saw Marco standing on the patio, watching us. He wasn't on the phone. He wasn't flanked by security.
He was just a father watching his daughter laugh. He caught my eye, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing the harsh lines of grief and power, making him look younger, almost peaceful. My heart did a strange, unfamiliar flutter. It was a perfect, sun-drenched moment of happiness, a glimpse of a future I hadn't dared to imagine. The illusion was shattered by a glint of light from above. I looked up and saw it, a small black drone, hovering silently just beyond the garden wall. A single, unblinking red light, like a malevolent eye, was fixed directly on us. The moment Marco saw the drone, the peace of the afternoon shattered into a million pieces. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying. "Ricardo, inside, now," he roared, the command cracking like a whip. He ran toward us, scooping a now frightened Lily into his arms and practically shouting me toward the house. Ricardo and two other men I'd never seen before materialized from the shadows of the estate, their faces grim, weapons suddenly visible. The mansion went into lockdown. Steel shutters I didn't even know existed slid down over the vast glass windows, plunging the house into a dim, artificial twilight. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the shouting. I held Lily, trying to soothe her whimpers, my own body trembling with adrenaline and fear. I could hear Marco in the next room, his voice on the phone a low, lethal snarl. It was the voice of the ghost, the man the underworld feared. He spoke in rapid Italian, but one word, one name cut through the torrent of angry language, a name spoken with such cold, venomous hatred that it made the hair on my arm stand up. Russo. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. The mechanical eye in the sky had a master, and now I knew his name. The threat was no longer a shadow. It had a face, a history, and it was watching us. The next day, a courier delivered a small, elegantly wrapped box addressed to me. Ricardo intercepted it at the door, his face a mask of professional caution. "Allow me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He took the box to the kitchen and carefully sliced it open with a knife, his movements precise and methodical. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a single, perfect white lily, its petals still dewy, identical to the thousands blooming in the garden outside. But it was what was wrapped around its stem that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was my locket, the small silver oval that held a tiny photograph of my mother. It had been a gift from her, and I never took it off. It had been ripped from my neck a few weeks ago, during what I thought was a clumsy, failed mugging attempt on my way home from the grocery store. I had reported it, mourned its loss, and moved on. But it hadn't been random. It was a message. They had been watching me long before Lily ever spoke my name. They knew who I was, where I went, and what was precious to me. The lily was from Marco's world, but the locket was from mine. The message was brutally, intimately clear. We can touch you. We can take anything or anyone you love. The gilded cage wasn't a fortress. It was a target, and I was standing right in the center of it. The lily and the locket changed everything. The mansion, once a sterile sanctuary, transformed into a high-security prison overnight. Marco moved with a barely contained rage, a storm gathering behind his eyes. He doubled the security, and men with hard faces and unseen weapons patrolled the perimeter day and night. He wanted to confine me and Lily to the upper floors, to wrap us in a layer of steel and concrete, but I refused.
I looked him dead in the eye, my fear a cold knot in my stomach, and told him that a cage, no matter how safe, was still a cage. "She can feel your fear, Marco," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "It's suffocating her. It's suffocating me." He stared at me, a muscle twitching in his jaw. For a moment, I thought he would overrule me, but instead he gave a curt nod. "Fine," he bit out. "We move. Tonight. There's a house in the mountains. No one knows about it, not even Russo." The plan was a desperate gamble, an admission that his fortress had already been breached. As the staff packed our bags in a hushed panic, I knew we weren't just fleeing a threat. We were running toward a confrontation we couldn't possibly avoid. The convoy of 3 identical black sedans moved through the city's glistening veins like a funeral procession. I sat in the back of the center car, Lily asleep in her car seat beside me, her small hand clutching my finger. Marco sat in the passenger seat, a rigid silhouette of tension, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound, a low thrum of anxiety that vibrated through the plush leather seats. We were on a freeway overpass, the city lights a dizzying blur below, when it happened. A massive construction truck, its headlights dark, suddenly swerved from the adjacent lane, its horn blaring a deafening war cry. Our driver cursed, wrenching the wheel, but it was too late. The impact was a brutal, deafening scream of metal on metal. The world became a kaleidoscope of shattering glass and violent motion. My body was thrown against the restraints, my head slamming against the window. Lily woke with a terrified shriek.
The car spun, hitting the median with a sickening crunch before lurching to a final, jarring halt. In the ringing silence that followed, I could hear the screech of other tires and the first, terrifying pop of gunfire. Our procession was broken, and we were trapped. Before the last echo of the crash faded, Marco was in motion. He was no longer the grieving father or the enigmatic businessman. He was the ghost, a creature of pure, lethal instinct. He twisted in his seat, his own weapon appearing in his hand as if by magic. "Stay down, don't move," he commanded, his voice a blade of ice. He kicked open his jammed door and was out of the car, using the ruined vehicle as a shield as he returned fire. The air filled with the sharp, percussive cracks of a war I had only ever seen in movies. He moved with a terrifying grace, a predator in his element. He wrenched my door open, his eyes wild and focused. "Elena, give me Lily, now," he ordered. I unbuckled her, my hands fumbling and clumsy with terror, and passed her small, trembling body into his arms. He then grabbed my arm, his grip like steel, and pulled me out of the car, shielding us with his own body. We ran, hunched low, the sounds of shouting and gunfire chasing us as we scrambled off the highway and plunged into the rain-slicked darkness of an industrial side street. We were alone, separated from his army, and being hunted. We found a temporary sanctuary in the skeletal remains of an old textile factory, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and rust. Marco kicked in a rotted door and ushered us inside, quickly barricading it with a fallen steel beam. The cavernous space was lit only by the faint, dirty glow of the city filtering through grimy, broken windows. Lily had finally cried herself to sleep, her small body curled against my chest, her breathing shallow and hitched with leftover fear. I sank to the floor, my back against a cold brick pillar, and started humming the lullaby my mother always sang to me, the simple melody of fragile shield against the violence outside. Marco stood guard by the door, his gun still in his hand, but his attention was on us. I saw the killer's mask fall away, revealing the raw agony beneath. He was bleeding from a shallow gash on his forearm, a dark stain spreading on the sleeve of his expensive white shirt. "You're hurt," I whispered, my own voice sounding foreign and thin. I ripped a strip of fabric from the hem of my blouse, ignoring his protest, and gently began to clean the wound. My small, defiant act of care felt like the only sane thing in a world that had completely lost its mind. "He did this before," Marco said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was almost lost in the cavernous silence. He didn't flinch as I pressed the makeshift bandage to his arm, but his eyes were 1,000 miles away, lost in a memory that was clearly as raw as his fresh wound. "With Isabella." The name hung in the air between us, a ghost given form. Russo arranged it, a truck on a quiet road. It was meant to look like a tragic accident. I was in another city, closing a deal. I got the call, and my world just ended. He finally looked at me,
his gaze so full of self-loathing and pain it was hard to bear. I had promised her, Elena. I told her I would build a fortress around her, that no one would ever touch her. She believed me. He shook his head, a slow, agonizing movement. My enemies saw my love for her as a weakness. They were right. I failed to protect the one person who mattered. I buried my wife because I was arrogant enough to believe I could have a family and this life at the same time. He wasn't just telling me a story. He was showing me the deepest, most defining wound of his soul. His confession cracked open something inside me, a shared fault line of grief and guilt. I made promises too, I whispered, my voice thick with tears I refused to let fall. To my mother. When she got sick, I told her not to worry about the bills, that I would handle everything. I told her to just focus on getting better. I could feel the phantom weight of those debts, the shame of the collection calls, the constant grinding fear. I worked 3 jobs. I sold everything of value she owned, but it was never enough. Every day I'd smile for her, telling her things were fine, while inside I was screaming. The last thing she said to me was that she was so proud of how strong I was. My voice broke. She died thinking I was strong, Marco, but I was just a girl drowning, pretending I could hold back the tide. We both made promises we couldn't keep, not because we weren't strong enough, but because we were up against things that were just bigger than us. In the cold, dusty darkness, surrounded by the threat of imminent death, we were finally just 2 people, stripped of our roles, connected by the universal, heartbreaking language of loss. The heavy silence was broken by a soft scraping sound at the barricaded door, followed by a low, familiar voice. "Boss, it's Ricardo." Relief washed over me so intensely my knees felt weak. Marco was on his feet in an instant, his gun raised, moving to the door and exchanging a series of coded questions and answers before he finally moved the beam. Ricardo slipped inside, his face grim, flanked by 2 other men. The immediate danger had passed. As his men secured the perimeter, Marco turned back to me. The harsh lines of the killer had softened, replaced by an expression of raw, unguarded emotion. He stepped close, his presence overwhelming in the small space, and slowly raised his hand. His fingers, calloused and warm, gently brushed a strand of damp hair from my face, his touch sending a jolt through my entire body. "He won't stop," Marco murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt more than heard. His dark eyes held mine, and in their depths I saw a terrifying clarity. "He sees you now. He understands what you are to her, what you are becoming to me. He's going to use you against me, Elena. Just like he used Isabella, it was a confession and a prophecy all in one. He wasn't just acknowledging the danger, he was acknowledging the reason for it. I was the reason. Our connection, the fragile, unspoken thing growing between us, had just made me the biggest target in his world. He didn't move his hand away. His thumb stroked my cheek in a gesture of impossible tenderness, a quiet claim in the midst of chaos. "I won't let him," he vowed, and the words were not a hollow promise like the one he'd made to his wife. This one was forged in failure and tempered by grief, a solemn oath spoken to me and to her ghost. In that single, breathtaking moment, my entire world shifted. Leaving was no longer a choice. My safety wasn't something I could find by running away, because Russo wasn't targeting an employee anymore. He was targeting Marco's heart, and somehow I had become it. Looking up at the fierce, protective determination in his eyes, I knew my life was no longer my own. It was bound to his, and to the little girl still sleeping in my arms, tied together by a love that was destined to be our salvation or our ruin. We were a family forged in gunfire, and our war had just begun. The mountain house was a fortress of timber and stone, nestled among ancient pines, a world away from the city's glare. It should have felt safe, but the silence inside was heavy, thick with the ghosts of the ambush. Lily slept fitfully in my arms, her dreams haunted by the shriek of metal and shattering glass. Marco paced the vast living room like a caged panther, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, lethal hum of Italian. I watched him, and the man I had shared a moment of vulnerability with in the factory was gone, replaced entirely by the ghost. The cold, empty predator was back, his eyes like chips of obsidian. Ricardo arrived just before dawn, his face etched with exhaustion and grim news. The highway attack had been a feint, a masterfully executed diversion. While Marco's forces were drawn into the firefight, Russo's men had hit his primary distribution hubs, torching 3 warehouses and a fleet of trucks. The financial blow was catastrophic, but it was the strategic humiliation that radiated from Marco in waves of palpable fury. He didn't shout or break anything. He simply went still, a terrifying, absolute calm that promised a retribution far worse than any storm. I held Lily tighter, a new kind of fear coiling in my stomach. I wasn't afraid of Russo anymore. I was terrified of what Marco would become to destroy him. The true blow landed the following afternoon, a strike so personal and cruel it felt like a physical violation. Ricardo approached me while I was trying to coax Lily into eating some soup, his face a mask of pained duty. "Elena," he began, his voice unnaturally gentle. "There's been an incident. It's Sophia." My blood ran cold. He explained that a black SUV had run her car off the road on her way home from her nursing shift. It was made to look like a reckless driving accident, but the message was unmistakable. She was alive, he assured me, but she was in the intensive care unit with multiple fractures and a severe concussion. The world tilted, the floor seeming to drop out from under me. It was my fault. This was because of me. Russo couldn't reach me here, so he had reached for the next best thing, the one piece of my old life I hadn't left behind. I was a contagion, a walking vulnerability that had just infected the kindest, most innocent person I knew. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. I looked from Ricardo's pitying eyes to the window, seeing not the peaceful forest, but the image of my best friend, broken in a hospital bed, because she had the misfortune of loving me. My grief and guilt quickly curdled into horror. I found Marco in his study, the phone call he was making echoing the one I'd overheard from my ex-husband's collectors, but 1,000 times more chilling. He was no longer a grieving father. He was a king commanding an execution. "No," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Not his son, his brother, the one with the restaurant in the old district. I want his family to see it. I want them to know this is what happens when you touch what is mine." He was targeting an innocent, a man whose only crime was sharing blood with his enemy. He was crossing a line, breaking the very code he claimed to live by, the one that supposedly separated him from monsters like Russo. When he hung up, I confronted him, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "What are you doing? You can't do that, Marco. That makes you just like him." He turned to me, his face a mask of stone. "This is how I keep you safe," he said, his words like ice shards. "This is the only language men like Russo understand."
I will burn his entire world to the ground to protect you and my daughter. But I wasn't looking at a protector anymore. I was looking at a monster of his own making, and the love I felt for him was being eclipsed by a profound, soul-deep terror. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place 2 days later. Marco's organization was in chaos, his lieutenants reeling from the warehouse fires and the escalating war with the Russo clan. Ricardo, his face gray with exhaustion, had been working non-stop, trying to understand how Russo had been one step ahead of them at every turn. He discovered the truth in a series of encrypted financial records. The leak hadn't come from a low-level soldier or a new recruit. It came from Luca, Marco's head of personal security, a man who had been with the DeLuca family for over 20 years, a man who had held Lily as a baby and had served as a pallbearer at Isabella's funeral. Russo hadn't bought his loyalty with money. He'd found Luca's secret, a sister hidden in a witness protection program, and threatened to expose her. The betrayal shattered what little remained of Marco's composure. This wasn't just a strategic failure. It was a deep, personal wound. His fortress, his code of loyalty, his entire world was built on a foundation of lies. If he couldn't trust a man like Luca, he couldn't trust anyone. The revelation hung in the air of the mountain house, a toxic poison proving that no wall was high enough to keep the rot from getting in. That night, as Marco dealt with the traitor in a way I didn't dare imagine, I made my decision. Every terrible thing that had happened since I'd entered this world, the attack on the highway, Sophia lying broken in a hospital, Marco's descent into monstrous vengeance, the betrayal of a trusted friend, it all led back to me. I was the vulnerability. I was the weakness Russo was exploiting with such surgical precision. My presence in their lives was not a healing balm.
It was a lit fuse on a bomb that was now detonating, destroying everything in its path. To save them, I had to disappear. With trembling hands, I packed a small bag, taking only the essentials and the framed photo of my mother. I wrote a short, tear-stained letter to Marco, leaving it on the pillow where I should have been sleeping. I told him I was sorry, that my love for Lily was the most real thing I had ever felt, but that love was now the very weapon being used to destroy her father. I told him to let me go, to erase me, so he could be the ghost again, unencumbered by a heart his enemies could target. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, an act of self-amputation to save the body from a spreading infection. He found me in the darkened foyer, my hand on the heavy oak door, the small bag at my feet. He must have seen the light from my room, or perhaps he just sensed my departure like a change in the atmosphere. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, the letter I'd written clutched in his hand. The silence was a screaming void between us. "Don't do this, Elena," he finally said, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "You won't be safer out there. He will find you." I turned to face him, my own heart a shattered mess in my chest. "This isn't about my safety," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "It's about yours and Lily's. Look at what's happened. Look at what you've become. I am the reason Sophia is in the hospital. I am the reason you're ordering hits on innocent men. I am your weak spot, Marco, and I can't live with that." He took a step closer, his face a mask of anguish. "You are not my weakness," he growled. "You are my strength." But I shook my head, the tears finally breaking free. "No," I sobbed. "Isabella was your strength, and look what happened to her. I won't be your ghost. I can't." He didn't try to stop me again. He saw the finality in my eyes, the absolute conviction born of guilt and terror. He understood that forcing me to stay would be a different kind of cruelty, turning his sanctuary into my prison. With a single curt nod, he summoned Ricardo and gave him a quiet, clipped order. An hour later, I was in the back of another black sedan, this one taking me away, not toward a new life, but into an exile of my own making. Ricardo drove in complete silence, dropping me at a clean, anonymous corporate apartment in a city hundreds of miles away, a place with no memories and no future. He handed me a key and a burner phone, assuring me that all of Sophia's medical care would be handled indefinitely. Then he was gone. I was alone, surrounded by beige walls and unfamiliar furniture, the silence a deafening roar. Back in the mountains, Marco stood in the doorway of Lily's room, watching a paid nanny try to soothe the little girl who kept crying out a single, heartbreaking word: Lena. Russo had won. He had surgically removed me from their lives, leaving Marco isolated, enraged, and more vulnerable than ever before. Everything we had started to build, our fragile, beautiful family, had been reduced to rubble. The silence Marco left behind was a living entity, a cold, strategic creature that mirrored the man himself. He did not rage or mourn my departure in any visible way. Instead, he channeled the gaping wound of my absence into a singular, chilling focus. He became the ghost in truth, a phantom moving through the digital and physical underworld, not for vengeance, but for reclamation.
He dissected Luca's betrayal, not with fury, but with the detached precision of a surgeon, tracing the lines of communication, the flow of money, the terrified whispers of those who knew of the traitor's weakness. He unraveled Russo's network thread by thread, identifying supply chains, political contacts, and safe houses with a terrifying efficiency. Ricardo told me later that Marco barely slept, subsisting on black coffee and a cold fire that burned behind his eyes. He kept my tear-stained letter on his desk, not as a memento of loss, but as a tactical document, a reminder of the asset he was fighting to recover. He was not a man grieving a lost love. He was a king who had suffered a strategic blow to his heart, and he was methodically preparing to burn the entire world to get it back, piece by agonizing piece. My own cage of beige walls and anonymous furniture was a different kind of hell. The safety I had run to felt like a punishment, each silent hour a testament to my failure and the pain I had caused Sophia. The guilt was a physical weight, a constant pressure behind my ribs that made it hard to breathe. But beneath the grief, the stubborn, resilient part of me, the part that had held my mother's hand through endless nights of pain, refused to simply be a victim. I was not a princess in a tower waiting for rescue. I was a fighter. Using the burner phone Ricardo had given me, I started making calls. I spoke to a former busboy from La Stella, a dishwasher, anyone who might have overheard the whispers of Russo's men.
I pieced together fragments of conversation, names of businesses, rumors about a certain upscale restaurant in the old district owned by his brother, Johnny. I spent hours online, cross-referencing public records, delivery manifests, and social media posts, building a fragile web of connections. It was a pathetic arsenal compared to Marco's empire, but it was mine. I was no longer just a liability to be protected. I was gathering my own intelligence, searching for a single thread I could pull to unravel the monster who had targeted my friends and torn my new family apart. My frantic search yielded a single crucial piece of leverage. Johnny Russo, the respectable face of the family, was not just a restaurateur. His establishment was the central hub for their money laundering operations. The constant flow of cash from imported specialty foods provided the perfect cover. His reputation, his carefully constructed civilian life, was the family's greatest asset and its most vulnerable point. I knew Marco's instinct would be to destroy it, to burn it to the ground as a message. But that would only escalate the violence, putting more innocent people like Sophia in the crossfire. So I made a desperate, perhaps foolish choice. I sent an anonymous email to Johnny, not threatening him, but appealing to the one thing I hoped we shared. I wrote about his 2 young daughters, whose pictures I'd found on his wife's public social media page. I wrote about what it was like to watch a child live in fear. It was a shot in the dark, an appeal to a man's conscience that he likely didn't possess. Meanwhile, Marco's own intelligence confirmed his worst fears. Russo was planning a public spectacle at the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, an event Marco was obligated to attend. Russo intended to use my absence to humiliate him, to show the world that the ghost had lost control. My desperate plea to Johnny Russo backfired spectacularly. It was not an appeal to his conscience. It was a homing beacon. Russo intercepted the message, and in my naive attempt at peace, I had handed him my exact location. The next afternoon, the sterile silence of my apartment was broken by a knock. It was Ricardo, his face etched with worry. He had brought Lily. He had broken Marco's direct order, convinced that seeing her, seeing what I was fighting for, would pull me from the depressive spiral he saw me in. For a few precious hours, it worked. We went to a small, quiet park nearby, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope as I pushed Lily on a swing, her delighted laughter a balm on my wounded soul. But then, the world seemed to slow, the cheerful park sounds fading into a low hum. I saw them first, 2 men in dark suits standing by the gate, another by the fountain. Their stillness was unnatural. Then Antonio Russo himself stepped out from behind a large oak tree, a predatory smile spreading across his face. He hadn't needed to hunt for me. I had led him right to his prize, and I had brought Marco's daughter along with me. The phone call to Marco was brutally simple. Russo's voice was slick with triumph as he laid out the terms. The park in 20 minutes, alone and unarmed. Any sign of police or his own men, and Lily and I would vanish forever. When Marco arrived, he was the calm center of a silent storm. He walked across the grass with a steady, deliberate pace, his eyes never leaving mine. The scene was a grotesque tableau. I stood by a brightly colored slide, Russo's arm casually draped around my shoulders, the cold point of a knife pressed discreetly into my side. Lily was a few feet away, held by one of his men, her small face streaked with confused tears. "It's over, Marco," Russo gloated, savoring his victory. "Your empire, your reputation. You will sign it all over to me, publicly, tomorrow.
Today, you just watch as I take what matters most." He expected a negotiation, a threat, a final act of defiance. Instead, Marco stopped 10 feet away, raised his empty hands, and looked directly at me, his gaze a raw apology and a fierce, unspoken promise. "You're right, Antonio," he said, his voice resonating with a strange peace. "It's over. Take it all. Just let them go." It was an act of complete and total surrender. In that charged second of Russo's stunned silence, as he savored the beautiful sound of Marco's defeat, I saw my opening. It wasn't a moment for heroics, but for a quiet, desperate gamble. I locked eyes with Russo, my voice a low, steady whisper that only he could hear. "Gianni's accounts. The offshore ledgers in Zurich. Marco has them all." It was a complete and utter bluff, a wild guess spun from late-night research, but the seed of truth in it was enough. Russo's eyes widened, a flicker of pure panic crossing his features as he instinctively glanced at his men. That single, stolen moment of distraction was all Marco needed. He wasn't alone.
Ricardo and 3 of his most trusted soldiers, disguised as a family having a picnic, moved with a silent, coordinated lethality that was breathtaking. The fight was over before it began. Russo was disarmed and subdued, his empire crumbling not from a hail of bullets, but from a whispered lie and a father's absolute love. In the chaotic aftermath, as Ricardo bundled a crying Lily into his arms, Marco came to me. He didn't embrace me. He simply stood there, stripped of his power and his rage, leaving only the man. "Come home, Alina," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as a companion, not for Lily, as my wife, as my family." I stepped into his arms, the choice no longer a question of safety, but of belonging. I was finally home. The weeks that followed the confrontation in the park were a quiet storm of reconstruction. Marco's world, once a kingdom built on fear and shadows, was systematically dismantled and rebuilt on a new foundation of fortified peace. Antonio Russo and his organization vanished from the city's whispers, not with a bang, but with a chilling, surgical silence that was far more terrifying. Marco's operations shifted. The more volatile aspects were cauterized and cut away, leaving a leaner, more legitimate empire that could be managed from a boardroom instead of a back alley. My role in this new world solidified in ways I never expected. I wasn't just the woman he loved. I became his partner in the truest sense. I took over the management of his restaurant chain, my old life as a waitress giving me an insight he'd never had. I visited the kitchens, learned the names of the staff, and transformed La Stella from a place of cold, high-end transactions into a warm, thriving establishment where loyalty was earned with respect, not fear. I was no longer a damsel in his dangerous world. I was helping him build a new one where we could actually live. 6 months later, the mountain house felt less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. The steel shutters remained permanently open, letting the sunlight stream in, and the sterile silence had been replaced by the constant, joyful chatter of a little girl who had found her voice and never wanted to lose it again. One evening, I found Marco on the floor of Lily's room, patiently allowing her to place a tiara of plastic flowers on his head. He looked up at me, the fearsome ghost replaced by a man utterly captivated by his daughter, and the smile that reached his eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Later that night, as we stood on the balcony overlooking the sleeping valley, he slipped a simple, elegant diamond band onto my finger. "This isn't a cage, Alina," he murmured, his voice low against my hair. "It's an anchor, for both of us." It wasn't a grand proposal, but a quiet statement of fact, a promise of a shared life built not on a debt or a duty, but on the simple, profound truth that we had become each other's home. The final ghost was laid to rest not with violence, but with a quiet act of creation. Sophia, now fully recovered and walking without a limp, became the head of nursing at a new pediatric trauma wing we funded at the city hospital. We named it the Isabella De Luca Center for Healing. It was my idea, a way to transform the pain of the past into a promise for the future, and Marco embraced it with a passion that healed something deep within him. He was no longer a man haunted by a failure to protect. He was a man building a legacy of it. The center became a beacon of hope, a place where families torn apart by tragedy could find the kind of support we had so desperately needed. It was a different kind of power, one that built up instead of tore down. By honoring Isabella's memory in this way, we weren't erasing her. We were integrating her into the foundation of our new family, ensuring that her light, the one Russo had tried so brutally to extinguish, would now shine on countless others, a testament to a love that violence could never truly conquer. Today, as I sit on that same balcony, a gentle breeze rustling the pines, the past feels like a story read from a book, not a life I actually lived. Below me, in the garden where I first saw a drone and felt the cold hand of fear, Marco is teaching a giggling, chattering Lily how to plant lilies of her own.
Her small hands are covered in dirt, and his tailored suit jacket is draped carelessly over a chair. He glances up at me, his hand coming to rest on my swollen belly, a protective, tender gesture that speaks volumes. We have built this piece, this ordinary, beautiful life, out of the wreckage of our sorrows. It is a testament to the fact that family isn't something you're born into, but something you build, you fight for, and you protect with every fiber of your being. Sharing this journey has been a part of my own healing, and I'm so grateful you've been here to listen. Your support helps stories like ours find the people who need them most, reminding us all that even after the darkest storm, the sun can and will shine again.